Good afternoon, and thanks for coming. I thought I would start out with a small mental experiment that I conducted in which I tried to look at an institution and ask myself, how could it more closely respect the autonomy of the people who were part of that institution? And it so happened that my partner's mother is 98 years old and lives in a retired person's facility in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And she hates it. It is a high-end facility. It doesn't stink. The staff are polite. It's nicely decorated. The food is completely acceptable. And again, the staff is about as attentive as you can imagine the staff to be. She hates it. And the reason she hates it is because it takes good care of her, but it doesn't respect her autonomy. And I tried to imagine how one could design a retired person's home. Autonomy is at the key of most anarchist thought. How one could redesign this retirement home that would respect the autonomy of its residents more closely. For example, I tried to think in particular detail how this might happen. She is in a room on the 5th floor. If she wants to go outside, she has to get dressed, go down the corridor, take an elevator, go through another corridor, and ask someone to open the door because the door is too hard for her to open all by herself. In my old people's home, there would not be a second floor. There would only be a first floor. Everyone would be have a sliding door that they could open themselves and let themselves out into an enclosed space designed as they wished it to, and maybe a larger space where they could meet with other people. In addition, this retirement facility is, of course, 400 people in their 80s and 90s all waiting to die. And there is no better recipe for a clinical depression than 400 people waiting to die. So in my old people's home, there will not be more than 12 old people. There will not be a second floor, or if there is a second floor, the second floor will be filled with students whose housing will be subsidized and who will do certain help the older residents. There will be a preschool right next door in which old people can help out as much as they like, only if they wish to, but there will be the sound of laughing children. There will be a tremendous amount of demographic variety, and it will not simply be a warehouse of people at the edge of their life, if you like. She also happens to be ethnically Chinese, and the food that she's given is white people's food. She hates it, even though it's good white people's food. In one of the few pleasures left to people of that age is the taste of food that they recognize and love and that they associate their comfort foods. So in my old people's home, at least twice a week, first of all, there's going to be a little garden where you can have help. You know, the gardens that are at waist height that a person in a walker can use. They can plant flowers and vegetables. People can help them of exactly what they want. And 2 or 3 times a week, someone will come in and do some of the shopping and help them prepare the meals that they love and that they want, and they may invite their friends to share those meals with. So that the idea, in a sense, is to take an institution that is actually quite brilliant at taking care of people and seeing how it can restore their sense of independence and autonomy and the choices they have in their daily life. I could go on in more detail about the design of institutions of this kind. I would also argue that one of the tremendous failings of neoclassical economics is in its analysis of firms' profit. I was going to introduce this later, but it seems appropriate right now. That the economists John Hicks and Arthur Pigou, the founders of welfare economics, they were interested in the way in which a productive process might produce outcomes that were negative for the society as a whole. So that Hicksian income, for example, land, labor, and capital, John Hicks asked, at the end of a productive process, are the factors of production still as robust as they were at the beginning? That is to say, if you're farming and you're mining the soil, right, and depleting all its nutrients, this should be charged against your income because the land available for the next stage of the productive process is far more depleted and without nutrients. I would argue as well that an anarchist would ask, what kind of person does this productive process produce, encourage, foster? That is to say, if you take artisans who are in charge of a complete production process and you turn them into assembly line workers on the order of Charlie Chaplin in modern times, doing the same repetitive motions every day, all day, you have, in John Hicks's terms, degraded the human material, the labor part of the sort of land, labor, and capital in classical economics, and you have degraded the human material. So in an anarchist world, you would have a gross human product that would be assessed, in which every production process would ask, what kind of people does this produce at the end of the process? Are they people with more capacities, more training, more inventive, have more scope for the use of their imagination and their contribution? And if you have degraded the human material, then this would be charged, if you like, against your profit. Pigou wanted to do this in terms of taxation as well. So in this case, the question of my favorite example of this is Alexis de Tocqueville happened to read The Wealth of Nations and admired it, actually. And Adam Smith's favorite example of the division of labor and its advantages was the pin factory. And at the end of his appreciation of The Wealth of Nations, Alexis de Tocqueville said, yes, it may be more efficient, but what can one expect of a man who has spent the last 20 years putting heads on pins, right? In that sense, he asked, what is the human product of the division of labor, in this case, that produces, if you like, a human being who has had his or her capacity for original contributions, initiative, and so on, degraded in this way. I'm going to get soon to the question of what I imagine my differences are with libertarians. And I should add that libertarians and anarchists are, for many issues, on the same side of the barricades. On the question of, let's say, gay marriage, abortion, social issues like that, on the issue of surveillance and so on, I would expect that David and I would have piles of rocks on the same side of the barricades, fighting against the people who were the enemies of this kind of freedom. And I have a slightly complicated relationship to anarchism. You'll notice that the title of my book is 2 Cheers for Anarchism, not 3 chairs. And so I want to mention my reservations, one of which is quite severe and might persuade some people that I'm not an anarchist at all. Most anarchists at the heyday of anarchism believed that scientific progress was going to solve all problems. That is to say, politics would disappear. For any question of social organization, any form of production, any form of the design of human communities and cities, there would be a single, unitary, best scientific answer. And that would eliminate the need for politics, because there would be a unitary scientific answer. Lenin believed this very strongly in State and Revolution, believed that, in a sense, all you had to do, seeing the command economy of the German state in the First World War and how long it lasted, his argument was that all you had to do was to change the captain on the bridge of the ship, and you could have the German economy now run by the proletariat. So he and anarchists both believed that that period of enormous scientific progress of what I call high modernism at the end of the 19th century persuaded them that eventually there would be no politics. I do not believe that. And I would argue that lots of things that are settled without politics, like the distribution of admissions to fine colleges and so on, in which are often done at big state universities by the numbers, it's a way of avoiding politics and convincing people that one is just simply turning the crank on a handle of objective merit. It seems to me that that is one of the most precious goods to be distributed in a democratic society, and it ought to be the subject of political discussion and not the subject of some mechanical process that pretends that there's no politics happening there. More, if you like, damaging to my case for being an anarchist is the fact that I actually don't think we can do without the state entirely. The state has not been everywhere and always the enemy of freedom and autonomy, but it usually has been historically. From 4000 BC, when we have the first states in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia in particular, until the French Revolution, that's 6 millennia, 6,000 years, before which, by the way, we lived without states quite successfully for 95% of Homo sapiens' time on Earth. The state for this period of 6 millennia was the most important macro-parasite of the human condition in terms of taxes, conscription, confiscation of harvests. And it's worth saying as well that the first big sedentary communities created a series of epidemics as well. It was a perfect epidemiological storm, so that around the year 0, when the disease pools of Africa, the Mediterranean, and India and China came together, you had the Antonine plague and a series of the Justinian plagues that took huge numbers of people. This is before the Black Plague of the 14th century. This is, for proponents of the state, seen to have, the human condition seems to have eased with the French Revolution. That is to say, as establishing the rights of man, as establishing for the first time a French citizen who enjoyed all the rights of French citizenship no matter where they were, the abolition of the feudal estates, and the legal equality before the state of every individual with certain rights. One could say that the state became, if you like, through the revolution, not the state established after the revolution, became an emancipatory state. But it's also important to notice that the French Revolution also established for the first time in history this direct connection between the state and the individual citizen, not mediated by intermediary social groups like guilds and estates and so on. And it made possible Napoleon's total mobilization for war that took place in the early 19th century in the invasion of Russia. So the French Revolution had ambiguous results in terms of being, if you like, an emancipatory movement of equality before the law, and at the same time made possible a kind of state intrusion into the life of citizens that make possible total conscription and total warfare. I think I want to say something about where I imagine David and I don't look at things the same way. And that is the question of market libertarianism. And for me, the consequences of massive inequalities in wealth and life chances and the way in which they make democracy, I think, impossible. That is to say, for those people who believe that free market exchange under conditions of great inequality must be both tolerated and allowed and authorized, my favorite example, and it's a polemic example, but I think a relevant one. In between the First and Second World Wars in China, it was common for starving peasant women to sell their children. They didn't have to sell their children, but they did sell their children often in order to eat. Some didn't. Now, one can argue that this is a free market exchange, and free market fundamentalists would argue that one should be free to sell oneself into slavery, for that matter, right? As John Locke says, the first piece of property you have is the property in your own body, and if you care to give it to someone else, trade it to someone else for something else, you're entitled to do that. I would say that the selling of children in China in between the wars, it may have been a free exchange, but no one can look at that and not see the overall structural condition that forces those kinds of coercive exchanges not to be an act of oppression and unfreedom. In a larger sense, of course, everything that's valuable to sort of human life moves from poor people to rich people, whether it's kidneys traded on the international market from the third world to the first world, whether it's the pattern of adoption of children, which costs a lot of money, given up usually by poor people who can't afford to take care of those children. So you have then the international trade in organs is an example of the kinds of intrusive power that radical differences in income and wealth and economic power actually produce. The democracy with such huge differences in income seems to me to be a rather cruel hoax. That is to say, the market doesn't weigh votes, the market weighs dollars. That is the currency of exchange and reciprocity. The ability, let's say, through Citizens United, of huge pools of wealth controlled by the top 1% of the income distribution to pour into campaigns, not just for the presidency, but for state legislatures in places where an influx of income can make a huge difference in a small race for, let's say, a state Senate seat or a state assembly seat in Wisconsin or Kansas or Oregon is extremely important. It's also the case that the lobbyists, it's not just that lobbyists own a certain number of legislators by the contributions that they make to their campaigns and the gifts that they are able and emoluments that they're able to offer. But it's also the fact that, as was kind of clear under the Bush administration, that the lobbyists themselves wrote the legislation so that they didn't have to look for loopholes. They wrote the loopholes into the legislation in the first place so that they would be there. This is completely obvious, for example, recently in the Monsanto-sponsored bill about GMOs, after Vermont and several other states passed laws saying that GMO crops ought to be labeled as such, a kind of Information Act, if you like, that I expect a libertarian ought to be in favor of. Monsanto and their lobbyists cooked up a bill that actually made GMO labels possible, but so arcane and difficult to understand and follow that it essentially gutted this effort because of the resources that they were able to bring to bear and the kind of power that they had over this legislation. That is to say, the state is supposed to prevent coercive market exchanges. But this is impossible when the state is purchased and made to do the bidding of the top of the income distribution. I have a series of questions, I guess, that I'd like to ask libertarians in general, and David in particular, perhaps. One is, why is it that the objects of market anarchy are less individuals than the fictional individual of the corporate entity, the limited liability corporation? When did, if you like, individuals become supplanted by fictional individuals carrying rights that are, in fact, enterprises and corporations? This seems to me a unjustified extension of libertarianism as it applies to individual human rights to a form of property and enterprise where it doesn't belong. I would also ask for those of us who are interested in democratic societies and the gross human product of production processes to ask themselves whether the modern corporation, or most business enterprises, whether they're corporate or not, they are authoritarian settings. They are, if you like, daily dictatorships. Most of the working population of the United States works in a social setting every day that is profoundly undemocratic, in which they are not anarchistic communes where everyone has equal power. And so people learn, if you like, the habits of living in an autocracy every day. How can you expect people who spend their working hours all day long living in an autocracy to somehow shed all that and become effective democratic citizens when they come home? And if they go back to a patriarchal family, they can also recapitulate the experience of authoritarianism within the family itself. But it seems to me that the structure of enterprise and the structure of most businesses, market institutions, are profoundly undemocratic, and they structure the daily life, the habits of looking over your shoulder, pleasing the boss, the kind of cravenness and, if you like, wariness of doing the right thing and staying on the right side, let's say, of the teacher in school or the boss. And all of these are, in a sense, inculcate habits that are essentially undemocratic. And that's why, of course, Jefferson thought that the independent farmer was the ideal democratic citizen, because he was the proprietor, the way the petty bourgeoisie is, of an independent enterprise. He decided exactly how much to work, how to work, what time to start, how to organize his enterprise, and who had therefore the kind of standing and experience and self-confidence that would make this person a democratic citizen able to resist forms of authoritarianism.
I'm delighted to be here. I have read 2 of James Scott's books, enjoyed them, learned from them. The one thing I found a little bit puzzling reading Seeing Like a State was that he was writing a book that market libertarians would obviously like. And every once in a while, he paused in his description of the horrors due to states trying to reorganize the societies they rule to make it clear that he wasn't one of those icky market libertarians. And I guess I have a somewhat more of an idea of why he had that odd policy now, and perhaps in my response I can perhaps correct some of his errors. But what I want to talk about now starts with a point that occurs at least to economists, which we refer to as the coordination problem. That any complicated society, in order to do almost anything, you must find some way of coordinating the activities of very large numbers of people. That if you want to make a pencil, you need chainsaws to cut down the trees, for which you need iron and steel and gasoline and copper and a bunch of other things, each of which, and if you trace back what it takes to make even a pencil, millions of people have to somehow take actions that will all mesh together. And so how do you manage that? And there are basically only two solutions to that problem, and one of them doesn't work. The one that doesn't work is central control. That you have somebody at the top who says, you do this, you do that, you do that, that'll all fit together. And that's workable for very small problems for small numbers of people. But when you get beyond that, the problems of the person at the top knowing enough, of controlling enough, of the complication of all of the dispersed information held by the individuals become unworkable. The solution that works is some form of decentralized control, of which the version that can be most clearly described is the standard economist's model of private property, trade, and prices, in which each individual is solving a little tiny part of the problem, and the value of what he is doing is communicated to him by what other people will pay for his output or his services. The cost of what he is using is communicated to him by what other people charge, and you thus get the problem solved not by a single central system, but by a dispersed and decentralized system. And the details of that can vary a lot. I can imagine a lot of different possible rules of property, and some trades are explicit and some trades are implicit, and some of them are favors for favors and so forth. But the general model, I think, of decentralized coordination is general and very powerful. And that then raises the question of whether that approach could be used for what optimists regard as the core functions of government. The optimistic view is the reason government exists is in order to protect rights, settle disputes, make law, that set of things. Now, pessimists, of which most of the time James is one, would say the reason government exists is in order to extort money and labor from the people it's ruling. And that may be a correct descriptive picture, but since what we want to know is, can we replace the parts of government that we like rather than the parts we don't like, that's not the relevant question. All right, so what I want to do is to sketch out how one could replace the core functions of government by a decentralized market sort of approach. And I found it a little bit odd reading James' books that as far as I can tell, he never discusses that. He discusses stateless societies in Southeast Asia and the equilibrium, as it were, between the states and the stateless society. He says some very interesting things, but I don't think he ever looks into the question, how do stateless societies manage not to be chaos? How is it that anarchy is not really chaos, as some people often think it is? And I thought that was a little bit strange because he's, among other things, an anthropologist. And there are multiple examples in the anthropological literature, societies much simpler than ours, but of functioning societies without governments. So I wanted to ask, could such a society exist in a modern developed society? And I sketched out what it might look like in a book I wrote about 40 years ago, a little over 40 years ago. And when doing research on various legal systems in the last decade or so, I concluded that I had been reinventing the wheel, that the traditional Somali, Romanachal, a variety of other societies were essentially primitive versions of what I was describing in a modern high division labor society. So let me give you my very simple sketch of how I could imagine a society with private property, with trade, without government working. You start out with a set of firms that sell their customers the service of protecting their rights and settling their disputes. Think of them as rights enforcement agencies. People choose to be customers of those firms just as people now choose to be customers of many other kinds of firms. And the problem that occurs to anybody immediately, for instance to Ayn Rand, but to also less intelligent people, is what happens when the customer of one firm accuses the customer of another firm of a crime? Does that mean the two firms end up fighting each other? And the answer to that is it probably doesn't, because fighting is very expensive. If my employees are slugging your employees or maybe shooting your employees, both of us have to pay hazard pay. Our customers will not be happy with having their front yards turned into free fire zones. One will not be able to predict whether one's property will or will not be protected. And therefore, the natural equilibrium of that system is for each pair of agencies that might come into conflict to agree in advance on a private court whose verdicts they will accept for such disputes. Now, you may say, since in this world there is no government, what enforces that contract? And the answer is it is enforced by what economists refer to as the discipline of constant dealings, the fact that the firms are repeat players. Each of them knows that if when the court verdict goes against its customer it refuses to go along, then next time the other one will refuse to go along, then they're back fighting, and pretty soon they'll lose all their customers to less warlike and more prudent competitors. So that's the very, very brief sketch of the kind of system that I'm imagining. And for those of you who are familiar with I.M. Lewis's work on Somali, northern Somaliland, my rights enforcement agency is a modern high division labor version of his Diapayan groups, which were groups of people, pre-formed coalitions who essentially enforced the rights of their members, shared the damage payments their members received, shared paying damage payments their members owed, and had mechanisms for setting up, not permanent contract, but accepted mechanisms for setting up arbitration to settle disputes. So what are the advantages of this way of doing things? And I think there are several. The first is what I would regard as the general advantage of markets over socialism, which is really the advantage of decentralized over centralized command and control systems, in this one, the individual firms have an incentive to do a good job of protecting their customers. Furthermore, the customers, unlike democratic voters, have an incentive to know which firm will do a good job of protecting them. I find it a little bit amusing that in a discussion of anarchy, James is so much concerned with government. If there is no government, we can't bribe it. If politicians have no favors to sell, nobody can buy them. But in a political system, you as an individual voter know that your vote has very, very approximately zero chance of affecting the outcome. Therefore, as a rational individual, most voters will not, in fact, devote time and energy to figuring out which candidate is better. They will devote some time and energy to figuring out which candidate they should support in order to get along with their friends, because that does affect them. But who they vote for does not affect the outcome for any individual voter, because he's one voter out of whatever it was this time, 100 million or so, something like that. On the other hand, when you are deciding what car to buy, your decision determines what you get. And similarly, in my system, when you are deciding which of various competing rights enforcement agencies does the best job of protecting its customers' rights, you have an incentive to try to actually compare how it's doing for you with how it's doing for your neighbor and deciding whether to switch. So there's a general argument, it seems to me, for market production over government-run production, and that argument applies to law enforcement just as much as it does to other activities. Furthermore, in my system, you have not only market production of law enforcement, but market production of law. That the rights enforcement agencies are contracting with private courts, with arbitration agencies. The arbitration agencies want to offer that package of legal rules to decide their verdicts that the rights enforcement agencies want in order to get customers. The rights enforcement agencies want to buy that package of legal rules that their customers want in order to get customers. and the customers have some incentive to try to pick, so far as they can, that rights enforcement agency that patronizes that arbitration agency that has the best set of laws. So, roughly speaking, I now have described a mechanism in which law itself is being produced on the market. Now, I could go into a lot more complication, but not within our time constraints. It's certainly not a perfect mechanism. I can't have any law I want because the law between me and you has got to be the same as the law between you and me. But the agencies that each of us are customers of have an incentive to try to bargain as nearly as they can to the law that best suits their mutual customers. And I go into that in much more detail elsewhere. There's another advantage, which is related to why I suppose I'm an anarchist. And that is that criminal law as it now exists is prosecuted by the state. That means that if you commit a crime the state likes, you will not be prosecuted. As presumably most of you know, the Director of National Intelligence committed unquestionably a felony when he testified under oath to Congress that the NSA did not collect any sort of information at all on millions or tens of millions of Americans. There is no chance at all that he will ever be charged with that particular felony, with perjury, which is what he committed. And I know worse examples. My initial example of that involved the killing of 2 Black Panthers in the 1960s by Chicago police by opening fire on an apartment full of sleeping people at night. None of those policemen were ever charged with murder. So part of what I want is a world where you don't have privileged actors who have special rights that the rest of us don't have, which it seems to me is roughly the definition of government, that doesn't mean everybody's equal. There is no world in which everybody's equal. People differ in their abilities, whether or not you have private property or estate or whatever. But it does mean that people have equal rights in a sense in which under a state they do not have equal rights. Now, I don't want to claim that there are no problems with what I'm describing. There are. Again, I've got limited amounts of time. But there are, I think, 3 major problems with the anarcho-capitalist vision. The first one is what I think of as the stability problem. Suppose you end up with only 2 or 3 rights enforcement agencies, say in what's now the United States. It is quite possible that it will occur to them that robbery is more profitable than business, and they will reinvent the state. All right? You could imagine those rights enforcement agencies either form a cartel, they merge into one agency, and it might be a worse state than you start with, right? Or alternatively, each of them agrees, we won't accept customers who used to be your customers. Each of us gets a monopoly of our present customers. Again, we're effectively a state. So that's one problem. And how likely that is really depends on the economics of the rights enforcement industry, whether economies of scale result in a few huge firms or lots of small firms. And that's probably going to vary from time to time and place to place. Second, very serious problem is how do you defend your stateless area from adjacent states? And James had some very interesting ideas with regard to the situation in the past in Southeast Asia about how you have a society which is unprofitable to try to annex. I'm not sure how I apply that to the modern world, but I'd like to figure out how to, because it's an interesting approach. And finally, you have a set of problems that I think of as market failure on the market for law. Market failure, to me, is situations where individual rationality fails to produce group rationality. That would be another talk, which I don't have time for, but you can find that talk on my webpage if you're curious. But the particular issue here is that there are situations where the legal rule between me and you affects him. And in that case, my agency and your agency will bargain to the rule that's best for us, but ignore the effect on outside third parties. So I am not claiming this is going to give a perfect legal system. On the other hand, as far as I can tell, the mechanisms that generate law at present are nowhere close to perfect, that there is almost no reason for the legal system to be anything like optimal, that democracy works very, very badly, which is why I'm less worried that trying to make it work well than James is, since I'd be happy to do without government and thus without democracy in the normal sense of the term. Let me go, for details of this, see my book, Machinery of Freedom. The third edition, which has more on this than anything else, is available as a Kindle for, I think, $2.99 on Amazon. The second edition is free as a PDF on my webpage. The print version of the book is, I think, about $10 from Amazon, and it's got a beautiful cover, the best cover I've ever had, which was made by a process that James would probably approve of. I put up a contest on my blog for people to design a cover for me. I offered them as a reward signed copies of all of my books, and I got literally the best cover I've ever gotten for any of my books out of that. So go admire it if you have a chance. It's up on the web. In any case, let me end with what strikes me as James' pessimism, which I think is not entirely warranted. That the depressing thing about reading The Art of Not Being Governed is that he pretty clearly believes that large parts of Southeast Asia have been stateless for the last couple of thousand years and won't be in the future. That the technological changes which increase the range and power of states mean that it is now not only possible but profitable to annex territories that it was not profitable to annex in the past. He may be correct about that. However, I think it is too simple a picture, because technological change at any time is having effects in many different directions, most of them unpredictable. That's part of the point of my book, Future Imperfect. I don't predict the future, I predict possible futures. And in particular, some of the technological changes are going to make states weaker. That digital cash, especially if we eventually have anonymous digital cash, makes it harder for governments to control people. That encryption in general, in particular public key encryption for those familiar with it, makes possible what I refer to as a world of strong privacy, in which online activities are invisible except to the parties involved in those activities. And if a government cannot see a transaction, it cannot tax or regulate that transaction. So one possible future out of many others is a world where our online world is anarchy, our real space world is still controlled by states, but the online anarchy weakens states because if large parts of your world are happening online, you are more mobile and therefore more able to run away from a state that you don't like. And of course, if much of your activity is happening online, that part of the activity is out from under the state. People fantasized that the growth of computers would make governments much more powerful because they could coordinate lots of information. If anything, I think it's been the other way around, that the growth of computers has given us things like WikiLeaks and Wikipedia for that matter, and the web more generally, a whole lot of decentralized ways of doing things that people thought that only the government could do. You might try to compare the Encyclopedia Britannica to Wikipedia. The Encyclopedia Britannica was done by essentially a centralized mechanism, Wikipedia a decentralized mechanism, and I've got a very nice 11th edition Britannica on a bookshelf in my house. I don't think I've opened it in the last year. It's ornamental. It was a great work of the human mind, but it's essentially worthless, almost worthless at this point. So finally, Scott argues at various places that the future is very uncertain. And if the future is very uncertain, I think predicting the death of anarchy, which in effect is what he is pessimistically doing, is a little premature. How much time do I have left?
You have 5 minutes.
Wonderful. In that case, I think I will end with some poetry about decentralized systems. In Washington, there isn't any plan with feeding David on page 64. It must be accidental that the milkman leaves a bottle at my door. It must be accidental that the butcher has carcasses arriving at his shop, the very place where when I need some meat, I accidentally stop. My life is chaos turned miraculous. I speak a word and people understand, although it must be gibberish, since words are not produced by governmental plan. Now, law and order, on the other hand, the state provides us for the public good. That's why there's instant justice on demand and safety in every neighborhood. I've still got a couple of minutes. Wonderful. Each section of Machinery of Freedom starts with a poem. Hobbes had a vision, certain, crystal clear. Through logic's lens alone, he clearly saw the state of nature red in tooth and claw, and sword and axe, where each man lives in fear. A nightmare world, unless a king appear, equipped with force enough to overawe all powers else and bend them to his law. A monarch absolute without a peer. One question yet remains. In many lands, men lived and fathered children, planted grain, slept soundly through the night, worked with their hands, together or apart for love or gain. How is it that the human race survived through the long years before the king arrived? A doctor synthesized the perfect cure for a disease that he was certain sure mankind without his aid could not endure. His flawless logic with no doubt implied that the disease existed. So he tried to offer up the cure on every side, and many patients took the cure and died. And let me end with a quote from R.J. Rummel, who has had a long research project on what he calls democide, counting up the numbers of people killed by their own governments. In total, during the first 88 years of this century, almost 170 million men, women, and children have been shot, beaten, tortured, knifed, burned, starved, frozen, crushed, or worked to death, or buried alive, drowned, hung, bombed, or killed in any other of the myriad ways governments have inflicted death on unarmed, helpless citizens or foreigners. And many patients took the cure and died.
I join my fellow panelists in being appalled by David's notion of central control. And I saw Jim winced at the notion of central control. So we have common ground on that. But I will, most of my remarks will be actually attacking anarcho-capitalism, of whom I'm using David as an example. So David is a good battler. He's heard criticisms before, and I will use also an example as we get farther down of the design of the city of Manhattan, where I think I have it, the best example I can think of that both Jim and David will be appalled at, and I will defend. So I will, if you know Manhattan, I'm coming to the street plan of Manhattan. Let me briefly try to distinguish the thought of these two actually old acquaintances of mine and friends, Jim and David. David is somebody, as his maximand is freedom. And it's interesting that Jim mentioned autonomy as something that's important, and I think in that way you can understand why they were sort of on the same wavelength, that these are very much related aspects. But my sense of the core of Jim's thought comes from his books, and I think is consistent with what he said today, but expands on it. Is that he has a bit of the Bernie Sanders in him, more than a bit. He is concerned about those who have less economic wealth, less political power, and that came through very, very clearly. And I think that is not a concern of David's. He's not against that necessarily, but his maximand is individual freedom, and he doesn't share that aspect. Another interesting aspect of Jim's work over the years is that he favors disruption and doesn't like stability. And so he can defend himself if I've mischaracterized his remarks, but my sense is that most of us actually thinks a stable society is a good society, but I think Jim likes to stir the pot a lot, and even if the people who had less were in charge and whatever, an interesting question for Jim is whether he would still like to stir the pot. Okay, with that introduction, let me turn to my slides, and as I say, this will be significantly aimed at David, who I identified, and I think he used the label himself, so he's happy to be called an anarcho-capitalist. I've identified others. Murray Rothbard, I think, is the quintessential person of this stripe. I also lump in Robert Nozick, who's probably the best known of the three authors, although David is an extremely well-known person as well. I distinguish them from people are classical liberals. And if you are tempted by libertarianism or whatever, I think you should read all of these works. The first two, in fact, are Nobel Prize winners in economics, and they are very different from the anarcho-capitalists. Both Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, who is actually David's father, as you know, thought very seriously about what the function of government should be, if any, and they ended up saying there is a positive role for government, unlike the anarcho-capitalists. And so they are much more on the wavelength that I will push today, which is in this setting of anarchism to defend some role for government. My best-known book is a book called Order Without Law, but as was nicely pointed out by John in its introductory remarks, this order without law, the norms and so forth that evolved underneath a state, and my own sense is that it probably is necessary. Without a state, you would not have a successful evolution of norms. Okay, what do we have if we do everything by contract? This is what the anarcho-capitalists would like to do. My own view is that transactions costs, to use a phrase from Law and Economics, are too great and you can't get there. You would give up all sorts of good things that we have because we have governments that you would not have. A classic example of this is the lighthouse. Ronald Coase, another Nobel Prize winner in economics, wrote a famous article that is cited here where he said, basically set this up as if a private enterprise could provide lighthouses. There is now a very substantial literature criticizing the Coase article, about 5 different authors and whatever, who pointed out that in fact the lighthouses in England at their peak survived because government customs officials were collecting mandatory dues in port. In fact, government was essential to the provision of lighthouses, with the occasional exception of monasteries who sometimes offered lighthouses and got contributions from passing ships. But this is an example. If you think lighthouses are a good idea, the historical evidence is you will not get them without affirmative government. Are New Yorkers proud of the Brooklyn Bridge? In the 19th century, they thought this was the cat's meow. Can you get the Brooklyn Bridge by contract? And I say, no. One of the reasons you can't get the Brooklyn Bridge by contract is that the approaches to the Brooklyn Bridge are roughly a mile long on both the Manhattan and the Brooklyn side. And to build the Brooklyn Bridge required the assembly of land for those approaches, which involved hundreds, if not thousands, of parcels of land. Any holdout, if you did it all by voluntary contract, would delay the Brooklyn Bridge by decades and decades and perhaps make it impossible. If you don't believe this, go to the Narita Airport, Tokyo's main airport, and look at their second airway. It is interrupted by a rice farmer they've not succeeded in buying out for 30 or 40 years. The power of eminent domain, which we study in law schools, is the power of compulsory purchase, coercion by government in return for just compensation. If you like the Brooklyn Bridge, you're not going to get there by voluntary contract. I now turn to the example which is a little less directed to David and more to Jim, because Jim doesn't like his wonderful book, Seeing Like the State, and this is the state writ large, or a classic expression of the state, the design of Manhattan in the northern sections of Manhattan. I start by showing you what Manhattan streets look like at the southern tip. There's a famous show out on Broadway now called Hamilton. Hamilton, when he arrived in Manhattan, arrived to a Manhattan which was just down, crammed into the southern tip. And basically you have anarchic street layouts that follow footpaths and cow paths, and Broad and Wall Street are examples of that particular area. What happened as Manhattan evolved was eventually we got the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, which laid out Manhattan in this very regular pattern that most of you have visited and know. The person who was responsible for this was named DeWitt Clinton, who interestingly was the mayor of Manhattan in 1808 when this got going, and was also a state senator. And Mayor Clinton wrote a letter to himself as State Senator Clinton and said, can you do something in Albany to get a street plan for Manhattan? He understood that local politics would work better at the state level than the city level for reasons that are lost to me, I must say. But this was basically a plan that came out in 1811. What had occurred between my prior slide of the early Manhattan and then, and this would be a good discussion that David and I might have. What happened was mini grids, what I will call mini grids of streets, were created that you see there on the slide. You also see them in Brooklyn. And so there were rectangles, but rectangular blocks were produced by, I assume, subdividers. We don't understand much about the process there, but they met together at odd angles. And if you want to have fun in Manhattan, this is the much more exotic part of Manhattan to visit. But then you see that north of NYU, basically today, you have this extraordinarily regular and boring, and I think relatively unaesthetic layout of streets, but they did it. And then the question is, why did they do it? So let me give you some advantages of having a grid of streets, which is what Philadelphia has and what Chicago has, every city but Boston has. But Boston, when they got to the Back Bay, went with the grid. And so why do you go with the grid? And actually, I'm interested in streets, and I think that governments play a role in the laying out of streets. It's easier to actually travel when you up and down the island of Manhattan. You get through streets in a way you did not prior to. Manhattan has the aspect that if you go there for the first time, in 5 minutes you say to yourself, I think I can find my way around this city. And there are an awful lot of cities where that's not true. In London, for example, they do the annoying thing when they have a straight street, they change the name every 2 blocks for historic reasons, and that makes it a little harder to find your way around. In Manhattan, you really can't find your way around. What's the purpose of cities? To exploit agglomeration economies where people can get together for social and economic transactions. Being able to find your way around easily is, in fact, a big advantage. The reason they said they went with rectangular blocks was they asserted correctly that the most valuable lots are rectangular lots because the most valuable buildings are rectangular buildings, because if you've ever spent any time in working with wood, you know that straight lines are a lot easier than curved lines. And so most of our beds and tables and the rest of it are rectangular, that go into rectangular buildings, that go best into rectangular lots. And rectangular lots are very advantageous, and the people who drew that map recognize it. There are fewer boundary disputes. We have work by economists supporting that, LibCap and Luke. And the New Yorkers would have said at the time, one of the reasons this has become a great city is 2 things that DeWitt Clinton did. One was laying out this city, which enabled these real estate transactions that I will now illustrate, but also DeWitt Clinton did the Erie Canal. You don't get the Erie Canal by contract. Again, holdouts are a problem. You're going to have to use the power of eminent domain, coercion. You're not going to get there in an anarcho-capitalist world. And New Yorkers in the 19th century thought the Erie Canal was a great thing. This is Harlem Rising. We don't know very much about the people who did this and whatever, but the builders who were building here knew what the street system was going to be like all around this area, and they built these brownstones that are now worth millions of dollars, even in the heart of Harlem. This is a really remarkable slide. If you think that you have an empty city and whatever, they know growth is coming, and it's partly coming because there's a coordinated street plan. I should modify my remark saying I'm not a big fan of Manhattan street plan in some ways. I think they didn't have enough open space. They had to retrofit with Central Park. And also it's a little bit boring, and maybe those long and narrow blocks are not the best way of going. The square blocks, as Chicago has, might be better. But the main point here is you're not going to get here by contract. Okay, here is, I think, the weakest area of policy analysis by anarcho-capitalists. It deals with air pollution. Air pollution travels the world. If we have pollution coming out of our automobiles, the whole world is affected eventually. How are we going to deal with this in a world of contract? And it turns out that the three anarcho-capitalists whose works I cited here have read each other, cite each other, and they all say the same thing. And they say things about how you're going to handle it through litigation. Now, I happen to be a lawyer, so I'm going to claim that I know something about litigation. And what they're going to do is they're going to have class action lawsuits by all of us against all of us, because that's all the people who are polluting and are suffering from polluting. And these will be decided, of course, by judges who don't know anything about air pollution particularly. They don't specialize in it. There are, as we say in the world, serious transactions costing. This is a nightmarish piece of a lawsuit that no court would ever handle and would ever entertain. All of us suing all of us because of our air pollution. A much simpler way of doing something like this is to have something like the EPA have emission standards for automobiles and require catalytic converters, whatever. And will government mess up? Am I a huge fan of the EPA and thinks it's flawless? No, I don't like central control. I'm worried, nervous about it, just like my co-panelists, but that's going to be a lot better than these class action lawsuits that people who think that we can do everything by contract. These are courts, notice that these are in courts. And I'm confused, David. You sometimes mention that you're going to have private courts and a whole series of private courts. When you have problems of a worldwide problem of air pollution, I'm not sure how it's going to work out by litigation under this regime. Last two slides. Anarcho-capitalists tend to be against the welfare state. I think our welfare state is full of waste, overlapping categories. The other thing is none of us possibly understand how it works. It's just too darn complicated. I know something about housing programs. I don't know a lick about Medicaid or the Earned Income Tax Credit, and how many of you do. We just can't figure out what the devil is going on. But the main point, I think anarcho-capitalists are of the ground because using money raised with taxation to aid people with less is coercion, which of course it is. That's a bad idea, and we shouldn't have a welfare state. I contrast that view with my allies, I claim here, two Nobel Prize winners, let me drop that, Hayek and Milton Friedman, who both thought long and hard about this and said maybe in the small village, maybe in the hunter-gatherer society, you don't need a welfare state, but today you don't. You do need it. Today, if you're walking in Hartford and a beggar is there, you have no way of figuring out whether this beggar is deserving, but there can be specialists who can figure that out for you, and a welfare state is therefore justified. So let me end by saying my own view is quite firm, is that anarcho-capitalism is a will-o'-the-wisp, given the reality of transactions cost, I think proved best by this example of air pollution, that you're not going to get that. You're not going to get the Brooklyn Bridge. All sorts of things that are desirable. Now, if you have government act, you're not going to have Pareto efficiency necessarily, Pareto superiority. There are going to be losers from these programs. You don't have to worry about that. But everything else. But if you value the Brooklyn Bridge, you value program against air pollution, that's the price that you're going to have to pay for utilitarian reasons. I think a more important debate for people who are attracted by our anarcho-capitalism to engage in is the current thought that there can be libertarian paternalism, an idea pushed by people like Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, who want to alter the choice architecture that people face. This is based on work in cognitive psychology. This is a very important debate. If you believe in individual choice, I think for people who have libertarian instincts to get involved in. So, end of remarks.
I wish it were the case, however, that all transactions between wealthy and poor and in legislative chambers and so on were the transactions of entrepreneurs offering goods for sale for people who want to buy those goods. It seems to me that, in fact, what you have to contend with, it seems to me, is that the differences in inherited wealth that is not producing any goods, and that is invested in property, in savings, much of which are not kind of invested in producing goods today, is something that is quite different from the fact that an entrepreneur produces a good that you want to buy. So it seems to me that the exchange that you're offering, market exchange, I'm on David's side in the sense that I think there are lots of transactions that can only be accomplished between buyers and sellers only through market exchange. But it doesn't, I don't think, answer the problem of the encrusted, inherited, embedded inequalities in wealth that manifest themselves in these corporations devising laws that enhance their profit even more and avoid safety standards and
See, we'll have you an anarchist very soon.
and fiddle with the regulations. So they're not just producing goods for sale; they're using their political weight and accumulated capital in order to tilt the playing rules in their favor.
Slightly complicated question, because to begin with, the rich will have better protection in the sense that they will probably buy a higher quality version of the service. If there are police, they'll come faster to them. They're more likely to have good burglar alarms and so forth. This, of course, is also the current situation. Indeed, it is the current situation not merely in the market. If you ask in our society, what are the goods and services in which poor people are most disadvantaged? The answer is schools and police protection. That is the two major services produced for them by government. So that's going to be true in any case. The place where I think you are mistaken is in assuming that not only will they have a higher quality of protection, but that they will have laws that favor them. And I think that's not very likely. I'm not sure it's impossible, but it's not very likely, because the relevant question in the agencies bargaining for laws is how much is this worth to our customers? And as a general rule, economically inefficient laws cost more dollars to the loser than they give dollars to the gainer. So while it gets complicated, if you think of it in utility terms, what's going on is that while the rich people have more dollars, they also have less utility per dollar. But if you think about the simplest case of a law saying I can steal from you, whether I'm rich or poor, the value to me of getting that law is less than the value to you of my not getting it. Because after all I steal is $100 from you. I'm $100 better off, you're $100 worse off. I've got to go to the trouble of stealing, you're doing the trouble of hiding your money, net loss, so I won't in fact bid for that law. But certainly the rich people in general, in any society where people are unequal, which is I think all societies, or richness is not always in money, are going to do better than poor people. In the Soviet Union, there was a lane in the highway for officials to use, so they didn't have to wait in line.
You said at first the rich will have better protection than when you're rich. You think this is going to solve itself, or is it going to be perpetual?
No, I think the rich will be better protected, just as they will have better restaurant food and nicer clothes and nicer houses. Now, what is true, however, is that the market division is less unequal than the democratic division, because you can only spend $1 once, whereas you can spend a vote as many times as the issue comes up. So if you think about, I want to go back to James, the very common analogy of dollars to votes. And part of what's wrong with that analogy is that suppose I've got $500 and you've got $1,000 and we're bidding for stuff. I spend my $500 bidding for what's most important to me, which is food. you spend some of your money, but any money you spend bidding me against me for food, you then don't have to bid for other things. So in fact, I will end up getting half as many dollars worth of stuff, but more than half as much value's worth of stuff, because I will be spending my dollars on whatever is worth to me. Suppose, however, I have a coalition with 10 votes and you have a coalition with 5 votes. All right, the example I give in Machinery of Freedom is to imagine that we're bidding for flour, and some of the flour is for making bread and some of them is for making paper mache puppets. All right? I outbid you if there's only enough flour for bread for one person. I don't outbid you if I'm bidding for food and you're bidding for both food and paper mache. On the other hand, if I've got a coalition, I outvote you first on the flour for food and then on the flour for paper mache. So that one of the problems with democratic voting is that it is less egalitarian. It's more egalitarian than it's one person, one vote. It's less egalitarian in that if you have the power, you can use it over and over again, whereas each dollar once spent is gone. Incidentally, something most people probably don't know is that famous line about who will guard the guardians did not originate in a political context at all. It originates as lines attributed to a Roman poet discussing the problem of how a husband will keep his wife faithful. Who will prevent her from sleeping with the man who he has set to watch her and make sure she isn't unfaithful to him. There's a wonderful response to it by an English poet called An English Padlock, but that would be another subject, by Matthew Pryor, who's quite charming. But in any case, but on your who will guard the guardians, in my system there are multiple agencies. Private individuals may well be armed as well. That's going to depend on that particular culture. There is no monopoly source of power, so the police are less of a problem than they are now. If you have an army, it would still be a problem, as it's potentially a problem. And armies do have military coups sometimes. But I think of national defense as a hard problem. That was the title of that chapter in my first edition. And it's a hard problem because national defense is inherently what economists call a public good, which means a good such that the producer can't control who gets it. And if a producer can't control who gets it, how did he get paid for it? And he needs to be paid for it to produce it. Various public goods are in fact produced privately in our society. And through a variety of ingenious but imperfect ways. And this particular public good might or might not get produced. Under some circumstances it won't, and then it's too early to abolish all of the government. In the third edition, I sketch out some possible ways in which you might produce it in a stateless society. And what I'm imagining there is essentially a sort of a stateless equivalent of what I see as the Second Amendment system, which was the combination of a small professional army and an enormous militia, which as I see it, that people in the 18th century had observed the lesson of Cromwell. And the lesson of Cromwell is professional armies beat amateur armies, and professional armies seize power. And so the solution, I think, that the founders came up was a small professional army and a very large militia. And one of the ways I sketch it is consider all of the people in our society who do military stuff for fun. The Civil War reenactments, the paintball people, the Society for Creative Anachronism people with swords and shields, and a whole bunch of other things. In a reasonably patriotic, stateless society, as one where people like their society, you could imagine a whole lot of people doing military training for fun, and then a small elite of professionals paid by charity and paid partly by selling their services to the masses as referees, trainers, things of that sort. And then if somebody invades, you put those two together. And actually, I published that a year or two ago, and recently someone pointed me at a news story about one of the Baltic states where a whole lot of people are in fact training in irregular warfare themselves as private individuals, just in case the Russians show up. Because they believe, partly with the lesson of things like Iraq and Afghanistan, that if a noticeable fraction of the population is armed and has the relevant skills, you can make it pretty expensive to conquer you. And this, in a sense, relates to one of the things I liked about one of James's books. Namely, see, James, I will defend this later, I don't think he knows enough economics, but he thinks like an economist. And he thinks like an economist in that the question is not can a state annex you, but does it pay a state to annex you? And he has a good discussion of that in his book. And similarly here, the issue is can you make it expensive enough for a state to annex you, so they choose not to do it. And the one further point is that if I'm right, and maybe I'm not, my society is going to be much more prosperous than other societies because I believe that the government interventions in our society make us a lot poorer. And if that's so, the richer our society is, the smaller the fraction of its income you have to raise in order to have an adequate volunteer national defense. If you think about real historical cases, some national defense is usually voluntary. During World War II, people donated their firearms in Britain to make sure that people had guns. During World War I, a large fraction of the suitable Australians volunteered for the army, even though it was not a very well-paid job, out of patriotism. People buy Israeli war bonds, which don't pay a very high interest rate. So I think part of the way in which you produce public goods is through some version of charity donation. Think about why you tip cab drivers, and that's really a public good if you think it through. Part of it is social pressure, having to do with the sorts of things that Bob has written about. So I think there are lots of imperfect ways in which you might do it. And if you are a small and weak state with a very powerful neighbor, you've got a real problem. If you're a large and wealthy state and the only two countries in a position to invade you are Mexico and Canada, then you can probably, without a state, defend yourself adequately.
David, would you pass the microphone to James?
Of course.
I just wanted to say a couple of things. Private enterprise warfare has been described, I think, most successfully by Max Weber, who calls it booty capitalism. And it was the standard form of medieval warfare in which a successful military enterprise was essentially a joint stock company in which the people who contributed horses, armed men, and so on agreed on a division of the loot in advance, depending on the amount that they had invested in the enterprise. So that you had, therefore, a tremendous amount of private enterprise warfare, in which, of course, the danger was that you would fail and either die or your men would die in the course of this. But we do have an historic example of private enterprise joint stock company warfare that pervaded much of medieval Europe. I want to say, I hope we get to, the problem with economists, I never reason like an economist, is that the objects we are dealing with are all Homo sapiens and their rights. It seems to me that the rights of natural objects, all other sort of life forms with which we share the planet, they, in Anglo-Saxon law, because they have no standing, right, don't qualify for any protection, any rights, and so on. It seems to me we live now in a world in which we have become the incompetent by default zookeepers for the entire natural world, which we are managing badly, and we do not have a legal system or a form of thought that would talk systematically about the rights of other life forms. Christopher Stone talked a little bit about this in Should Trees Have Standing? And there, it's also not about cash. That is to say, his point is, if you sue the way you would for a minor or an incompetent person as their guardian, if you were to sue on behalf of, let's say, the dolphins of the lower Yangtze River, all of whom have now been exterminated, you would not be suing for money. You would be suing for, that is, you destroyed 50 Yangtze River dolphins. You owe us 50 Yangtze River dolphins, and you then have to restore the entire ecosystem that would support those. So it seems to me that somehow our system of economic reasoning and our political reasoning about human rights kind of misses a dimension that is a preposterous gap in the current situation in which we find ourselves.
Just two very brief things. I wanted to give an even better example of Jim's point about entrepreneurial warfare, and that's the Norse armies that ravaged England until they were eventually stopped by Alfred the Great, because those armies were not national armies. That is, the ones Jim's talking about mostly were national armies, but the Norse armies were entrepreneurial projects. Somebody who had a good reputation as a leader said, look, there's land and loot in Anglo-Saxon England, and with luck they'll pay us off to leave. Let's go. So that would be a better example. But with regard to the point he just made, I would point out that not only do dolphins not pay, they also don't vote. So democracy is not a solution for this problem.
That's the problem of the bane of most anarchists, which is the nation state. It seems to me that, in fact, given an international economy and an international division of labor, a lot of the environmental damage that occurs is, if you like, subcontracted and offshore. When someone asked George Orwell why there wasn't a revolution in England, he said the answer is simple: it's because our proletariat is in India. And in the same way, a tremendous amount of the pollution of also the kind of oppression of workers and conditions in mines and so on are things because of the long supply chains that are completely outside our ken and from which we are preserved. If you like, it is oppression at a distance, in the same way that the person who drops a bomb from a B-52 bomb site doesn't see the sort of human consequences of their activity. In the same way, if you like, no one asks what brought essentially this good that we now consume to us, and where along the supply chain are the things which would appall us were we to know how they were created.
I have to say, I don't know enough about either of your examples to really comment on it. I don't even know in what sense they're anarchist as opposed to simply new states, because after all, a new state within an old state's territory is creating an autonomous sphere too. So it may be that the other people know more about it, but I try not to talk about things I know nothing about.
That's never deterred me. I did want to say something about Chiapas. However, what's interesting about Chiapas is the kind of zone of autonomy that they have created, and there are thousands and thousands of historical examples. In fact, most kind of nation states began, if you like, as the creation of a zone of autonomy against an empire of one kind or another that eventually got, in the Versailles Treaty, got recognized as nation states. So what's interesting about Chiapas is the way, and this is perhaps relevant at an international level to what Bob was saying. So 30 years ago, from what I understand, Zapatistas, or people in Chiapas, were arguing for autonomy and land rights and so on in a Marxist and socialist vocabulary, and were connected to the trade unions in Acapulco and Mexico City. The same people, after kind of 30 years, after 1989, if you like, the socialist argument for this lost a lot of its kind of international appeal and its connections to the larger world. And now, what the people in Chiapas are doing is making roughly the same claims, but in the context of the UN declarations on indigenous rights and so on. And so they've found in it, if you like, not in any opportunistic sense, but by a gradual change, they have been able to kind of frame their struggle in a completely different framework that connects them not to the trade unions in Mexico City, but to international lawyers in Geneva and New York and indigenous rights treaties and human rights groups all over the world. So it's interesting to me that there is, if you like, a kind of legitimating larger legal framework, not exactly effective in the world, but which is, if you like, a symbolic resource.
I was hoping to correct some of James' economic errors, and I want to start out by his case of mining the soil. If a farmer or a farm firm is depleting the soil belongs to it. The soil is now becoming less valuable, will produce less for it in the future, so that does go into the balance sheet of the firm to the extent that it understands it. The same thing is true less directly of mining the worker. That if that means that the worker is changing in the ways the worker doesn't like, then firms will have to pay more to get workers to do that job than to get them to do jobs that change in the ways they do like. If it means the worker is changing in ways that make him less productive in the future, then that cost comes to the worker in his future wage and again will affect the wage at which they can get workers. That one of the things James seems to keep missing when he tries to equate the horror stories he correctly tells about the state with the horror stories he incorrectly tells about the market is that on markets you need people's assent to get them to work for you, buy from you, sell to you, and so forth. James also seems to think that economists think the purpose of economics is to maximize the GNP, which is nonsense. Going all the way back to Alfred Marshall, who pointed out that when a man marries his housekeeper, the national income goes down, as evidence that national income is not really a very good measure. What economists normally do in understanding what will happen is to assume that individual actors maximize their welfare, which depends on income, but lots of things other than income. And insofar as economists themselves have a maximand, it is what we call economic efficiency, which is a rather imperfect proxy for total utility for the philosophers in the audience. As far as inequality is concerned, inequality indeed subverts democracy, and I suppose since we haven't persuaded James to be an anarchist yet, that's a problem for him. But even without inequality, democracy works very, very badly, for lots of reasons I could go into if I had more than 3 minutes to do it in. Inequality is not in itself a bad thing. I would prefer a world where 99% of the people have $50,000 and 1% have $500,000 to a world where everybody has an equal $30,000. That the implicit argument that's always being made is the claim that the rich have somehow stolen their wealth from the poor. And that's a claim that has to be justified. It can't just be assumed, since on the market context, you normally get your wealth by producing something other people value and getting paid for it. I've already made my points about dollars versus votes. I was a little disappointed to discover that while James has done a brilliant job of seeing what's wrong with some parts of the left-wing orthodoxy, he is much too willing to accept other parts, as illustrated by his talking about Citizens United, prior to which case the Koch brothers could give as much money as they wanted to groups that were campaigning for policies that they wanted. The only thing Citizens United is a case of something that's been made into a sort of a devil object by people for political reasons, but Citizens United only meant that firms and labor unions and nonprofits could do the same things that rich people could do anyway. Now, I'd like to rebut all of the mistakes in Bob Ellickson's talk, but I thought that dealing with James Scott was a higher priority activity.
This is funny.
Well, James, you rate higher. So 3 minutes for James Scott.
The study done by English historians of the great fortunes in the 16th century, they asked the question of how these fortunes were made. And it's not my favorite explanation, which I think Balzac said, behind every great fortune is a great crime. And it seems to me, if you're talking about Mr. Rockefeller and so on, and his goons and buying legislatures and using hitmen, that's in fact the case. But in the case of the sort of English great fortunes and all the great aristocratic houses, they made their money by holding office in the state, under the crown. And that's where they they acquired monopoly properties, parts of the sort of customs office, so that in a sense it wasn't that in America, where great fortunes often lead to political office, as we've seen. It's the other way around, that office led to great political fortunes. And as for the Hixian income and destroying the soil, I want to provide David with two concrete examples. One of them is Trump's declarations of bankruptcy, used strategically the bankruptcy laws in order to escape a pile of debts and not have to be responsible for them. And the other actually is an environmental case. I don't know how many of you are familiar with what's called the cutover. So the mines and railroads bought huge amounts of Upper Peninsula, Minnesota and Wisconsin and so on, and it actually kind of clear-cut, essentially, that entire forest. And there was an enormous kind of fortune. The land was extremely cheap, and the timber was sold and fetched enormous profits. Then, of course, rather than having to absorb the price of holding on to that property because they had to pay all the sort of county property taxes on this property, they just simply abandoned it. The entire area was completely abandoned, and it then became, in a sense, useless land that was owned by the states of Wisconsin and Minnesota. So the idea that the corporation lives forever and has to assume responsibility for the environmental crimes and other crimes that it creates is historically, I think, nonsense. And so the Hixian income argument does in fact hold true, and most of the, if you like, environmental and human rights insults of corporations, as I said, are extraterritorial these days, and therefore they're hidden from us. I wanted to say something that I think is it's a curlicue on Bob's point, and that is this question of grid cities and traditional cities. So, in a sense, Lower Manhattan, Wall Street, in fact, was the old wall of the Dutch settlement. That below Wall Street, the streets observe this sort of idiosyncratic characteristic, because they are the instantiation of footpaths that people use to get water, to shop, and so on. And over time, they actually became streets and roads and acquired the formal properties of the street. The character of Lower Manhattan is particularly interesting. It's why lots of people want to live there, provide something of its variety, and I add that you need a local tracker to find your way around Lower Manhattan. And if you're in Upper Manhattan, as long as you can count, you have the avenues and streets, and that makes it enormously useful for the police, for example. That is to say, the ancient souk of Damascus and old cities that have this character that I described for Manhattan south of Wall Street, these are, in a sense, cities in which the autonomy of the residents is maximized and their visibility, if you like. If you want to cross someone in Upper Manhattan, it's easy to find them if you're the police, if you know their address. So they are legible cities, and they're built not only because Enlightenment people liked legible cities that had this kind of visual order to them, but it was a form of both creating commercial blocks that were modules that could be sold as units, and they were useful for state activity, surveillance, and policing. So in that sense, the nature of now, I think as David pointed out, that new technologies, it's not as if this is a question of sheer geography. So that, in a sense, invisibility and illegibility are a social creation as well. And my favorite example of that is the argument that some of you may remember from Casablanca, where a German officer is bragging about how the Germans will one day be in Manhattan. And Rick, aka Humphrey Bogart, says, there are some sections of Manhattan that I would advise you not to get. The point is that there are lots of cities in which, for reasons of third world slums and so on, where the police don't dare to go, because in a sense, the local population and gangs, I might add, have in a sense declared autonomy and prevent this area from being police very successful.
Thank you,
The
Jim.
last thing I want to say is that the grid is insane when you have a very variegated, steep landscape. In San Francisco, these insane roads, they installed all these grids on the landscape that made them, rather than following the contours of the land, you have these almost undrivable, and then you have a series of grids that intermesh at odd angles, and if you get in the seam of two different grids, I defy you to find your way without a GPS system.
Bob, 3 minutes, please, Bob.
Yeah. Well, Lower Manhattan, before this 1811 grid was put in and solved the problem of the intersecting grids. Let me say a brief word about Jim's defense of the lowest part of Manhattan. My sense is, in the 19th century, New Yorkers for 60 to 90 years stuck with this plan and built these streets. It was enormously laborious effort. This was at a time of laissez-faire, at a peak in the United States where big government was not much admired, so why did they do it? I think they did it because it raised the land values. If mainly what the effect of grid is, it helps police catch misbehave, I think that would lower land values. I think the main thing that happened in Manhattan was it was easier for people to find restaurants and to travel and so forth. And I don't think they would have done this if they had a negative effect on land values. I think the effect on land values was positive. To David, a comment. He asserted, as I understood him, that in an anarcho-capitalist society, you would have a richer society than we currently have, and he's nodding to show that I'm not mistaken. In my view, this is exactly wrong. That in an anarchist-capitalist society, you'd have a vastly poorer society for two reasons. One is outcomes. You would not get things like the Brooklyn Bridge or major airports, you could get them much more slowly. Secondly is you would have all this waste through transactions costs. This would be very, very good for lawyers putting together these contracts with these protection agencies and trying to overcome holdouts that we now overcome through the sort of power of eminent domain. So you would have much worse outcomes, and you would have very, very high transactions costs. I think anarcho-capitalism is, once you take those considerations into account, is a will of the West, not worth pursuing.
So next year we'll have to schedule a debate between you and me. I don't have time.